Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? We're about ready to start the program, and I'm going to introduce Phil Bartonetti.
Good morning. This is indeed a very special event for us with four handsome and special people up here in front. First thing that was pointed out to me is that Bud Rice was violating a club rule, but we did get a waiver for him to wear head covering in the dining room, so you're all right. Second thing of a procedural nature, we decided it would be better if we had written questions, so if you have any questions, write them out. Chuck Davis, Bud Rice will pick them up later in the program, and we want you to know that afterwards, each of the gentlemen has agreed to have personal conversations with anyone who has a particular question they want to ask. This is kind of a particularly appropriate month to do this because I realized it was 79 years ago this month that what is truly called the greatest war, to distinguish it from the Great War, began. It affected the world in a way nothing else has. 60 million people, and that's a conservative number, died. 3% of the entire world population. And the war had really begun before then. The Japanese were in China starting strongly in 1937. And for the United States, it all happened December 7th, 1941, continued to August 14th or 15th of 1945 because of the international date line. And the four gentlemen we have here are part of that history. And the first thing I wanted to do was do a roll call, and if we could start with you, Bud, you don't have to give your name, but give the unit you were with, the highest rank you achieved, and when you entered the service.
Am I alive here?
You are alive, like a pro.
I mean, it lasts much longer. Anyway, my name is Julian A. Rice. I was a member of the 316 Troop Carrier Group, and I flew 800 hours over in Europe, working especially with General Gavin and his 82nd Airborne Paratroopers. So I was very, very lucky. I lost a lot of good friends over there. And that's what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about tonight.
Well, thank you very much. Now we're going to move to the two Georges. Our first George.
12th Air Force, the first lieutenant, North African Theater.
All right, our next George.
I'm George Jaquis. I was in the Army Air Corps. I was in the 15th Air Force, and I flew out of Foggia, Italy.
All right, and Jeff.
What?
No. Jeff?
I'm Jeff Arnett. I was a first lieutenant flying in China and Burma, flying C-47s in a manner never thought of by the designer of that aircraft.
This is a real example, gentlemen, of gradeflation. Our last major conflict in Vietnam, folks like you would have come out majors. I mean, they were very stingy with rank. The next thing that I want each of you to tell us, because I know it was a point in time that most of us in this room did not share with you because we weren't around yet. But a day, we all talk about days we remember for most of us. It's the Kennedy assassination. You know where you were, I want to know where you were when you heard about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And again, if you could lead us off, Bud.
At the time, I was working for the Panama Canal, and my two best friends and I were watching a movie, Gone with the Wind. And all of a sudden, the lights came on in the theater, and he said that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and we suspect the Panama Canal will be the next target. So go home immediately and stand by the radio for further instructions. So my two best friends and I, we went down and we resigned from the Panama Canal at Mechanical Division. And we went out to the local Air Force Academy, and we took the examination and passed it. And in April, we were taken into the service. And they asked me if I wanted to be security or in the kitchen. I said, I'll take security. So they gave me a rifle, but I don't think there's any ammunition in it. Then they took me out in the middle of the jungle in Panama, and I had to climb into this machine gun nest, which I was supposed to guard from the Japanese. But it was the scary thing, hearing all those jungle animals at midnight. So,
Well, the one thing, Bud, we did some research on this, and during your defense of the canal, there was not one incident with the Japanese or any other foreign power. So we want to thank you for that. George Joseph, where were you on the 7th?
I was at a military base in San Antonio.
And what were you doing there, of all things?
Well, I had enlisted in February of '41, so I was undergoing training.
I imagine the atmosphere on the base was excited and concerned?
Excited, but not concerned.
Not concerned, all right. George?
I was in my dad's car driving around town with my high school sweetheart.
Did she tell you to sign up?
What?
Did she tell you to sign up?
No, I was too young then.
Jeff?
I want you, when you get home, to get the atlas out and look up Kunming, China. About 70 miles east of that is a place called Luliang, where we were based. The base kind of went nuts, except for the planes that were in the air. It was still pretty orderly. But we had a great celebration that evening, laughing and crying and everything else about it.
Okay. The gentleman to my immediate right is 98 years young, but subtract the number of years back to Pearl Harbor, and he was a young man then, and the people to his right were even younger. And to think that they were entrusted with what was then the greatest destructive force in terms of Air Force, even though we were just building up that. They were put in charge of very, very expensive machinery. And what I'd like each one of them to tell us about is the type of training they received before they were put into combat. Bud?
well, my two best friends enlisted with me, and they flew us up to San Antonio, Texas for primary training. And there was a very gruff sergeant who met us, and he said, all right, you guys stand at attention. There's a war on, you know. He says, now look at the guy on your right. Look at the guy on your left. He says, only one of the three is going to come back. Depends on the one who learns the most when you're going through training. So, sadly, it was true. My two best friends were gone before the year was out. And you just never know what's going to happen. One of them graduated and was being flown with some other pilots out to a base in California, and they ran into a terrible thunderstorm and crashed in one of the mountains in California. So they were killed. My other friend had to jump out of a burning airplane, and he pulled the parachute too early. His foot was caught in the structure of the cockpit, and it yanked him out so hard, it broke all of the bones in his body. He just was total loss, so they couldn't put him back together, and he was discharged. So that's what happened to my two best friends. Anyway, I flew, if I can mention it, a C-47. I had put in for P-47s. When I graduated, they said, you're going to C-47s. I said, you must have made a mistake or a typo. I put in for P-47. Oh no, get out of here, Rice, you're going into C-47s. So I didn't know how lucky I was, because I don't know if any of you watch the Smithsonian Channel, but they said the three most famous airplanes in the world, number one was a C-47. And I can testify that it was a wonderful airplane. I was lucky they didn't put me in P-47s. But I flew over on the Western Front, and I flew 800 hours during the war, flying mostly paratroops, towing gliders in, and then flying in after the beach landing on Normandy, making my way through the barrage balloons, and landing on a metal strip that had been put down by the engineers. And then I picked up the wounded and flew them back to England for hospitalization. And it was a daily routine after that. So we carried paratroopers mostly, and we dropped them. And then the next day we come in and bring them supplies or land and take out the wounded.
Bud, one question. Were you ever jealous of those guys from the 82nd or the 101st Airborne who were jumping out of your plane?
Oh, yes. They were wonderful. General Gavin was one of the youngest generals, and he was head of the 82nd Airborne. And we worked very closely with him. Our first mission was Normandy.
Well, I'm gonna stop you there because I want you to save that story. That's a special story.
Okay.
And George Joseph, give us an idea of your training. You were a pilot also?
No.
No.
I enlisted in the Air Force in Huntington, West Virginia. February of 41. I was sent to San Antonio, Texas. Stayed there about 3 months, just marching and eating. And then I went to airplane mechanics school for 6 months in Rantoul, Illinois. Finished that, and I was applying for cadet training, and I was notified that I'd been accepted. So I went to Santa Ana, California, and they gave us psychological tests to see whether we would become pilots, navigators, or bombardiers. And they asked us what we preferred, and I said navigator, because I'm pretty good with math. And so we took the tests, and they called us in, and they said, oh, you're going to be a pilot. And I said, well, that's a problem, because I've never driven a car. And they said, it makes no difference. The tests know what's best for you. So I said, okay. So went to Thunderbird Field, Phoenix, Arizona, and started studying and also learning to fly. We flew these old Stearman biplanes, and they expected you to solo in 8 hours, which I did. And so one day my trainer wasn't there, and I got a substitute, and I knew who he was. He was called Washing Machine Mapes. So he told me, go to a certain place and do spins and stalls, and then come back and land. So I went over to there and did the spins and stalls, and I came back to land, and I said, well, nobody in the air. And then I saw why. There was a big red sock that was 90 degrees to the runway, which means you're not even supposed to be up in the air. So I knew there was a strong crosswind, and I had to land in it. And I'd never done it, but I'd read about it. So I bought the plane end and dipped it into the wind, but I didn't straighten it out quick enough, so it started circling. And I'd been told if you get into trouble, pull the stick back in your stomach. So I pulled the stick back in my stomach and got up in the air, and I was pretty disgusted, so I didn't want to go through the landing pattern. So I landed, I came down, set it down. So went into the office, and my new trainer said, have you had any math experience? I said, yeah. He said, you're going to make a good navigator. So went to navigation school in Sacramento, California. Everything was in a hurry at that time, and so we graduated, fairly quickly, and then did some training in the Middle West and wound up in Florida, and then on the way down through the Caribbean to South America. There we were supposed to fly across the ocean at night in a B-17. We barely had enough fuel to get there, but we got there, although the red lights came on. And so we were about a month in Marrakesh, Morocco, living in an old French military barracks. And then we developed an airfield. We built one right from scratch in Algiers, that is near a city called Constantine. And we began to fly our missions, starting out against Rommel. Rommel was in North Africa, and we wanted to get him out of there. So that was our first mission, to get him out of there. And then we began to bomb up through Italy and Sicily and shipping in the Mediterranean. We did knock out a German warship that we caught in the harbor just sitting still. And we dropped a lot of 500-pound bombs on that guy. Anyway, after 50 missions, I came back to the United States to train other crews, and I served out my time there. And I think you wanted us to say what happened on D-Day. Well, the Air Force people were a little bit different than maybe others. So on Air Force Day, when we got the news, they first went after the commanding officer, They brought him to the bar. We locked him in a refrigerator. And everybody had a big party.
Thank you, George. I think both of the Georges were on B-17s. George, you were on a B-17, correct?
Yes.
And they said you couldn't make it as a navigator, so you were a bombardier. Is that what I read?
No, I chose to be a bombardier.
Tell us about your training and
Oh.
your time as a bombardier.
Are you going to have us make speeches after this?
After this, yes.
Because my speech is mostly about how I was trained and that kind of stuff.
Wait, give us just a little flavor then. Give us a little preview of your length of your training. And how old were you at the time you were there?
I went into service when I was 19, 2 days after I went into service. I was at various different fields in Oklahoma and Texas. I did about, well, they just trained us in everything that you do with a bomb site. And that took a lot of time. We had lots of other things to do other than being trained for that, but that's pretty much in there, Phil. I'm kind of hard to say what was special in that, my training.
Can you give us an idea? Two of you were in B-17s. What was the size of the crew? On
No,
that
10.
plane? 10. Because I read somewhere that George McGovern served at the base that you flew from in Italy.
But he was in a B-24.
He was in 24s. Now, how much higher or how much lower did 17s fly?
The B-17s flew usually around 25,000 feet, and the B-24s are a couple thousand below us.
Okay. And at that height, at that time, with the stage of technology, what was the temperature in the cockpit when you were at altitude?
50 to 60 degrees below zero.
Yeah. Can you give us an idea of how you were dressed for that type of weather?
Yeah, and that's in my speech.
Well, that's in your speech. Oh. I love a man who's got a touchstone. That's good. All right, well, we'll come back to that because a question that I want to find out about is about that guy who sat below the pilot in that little bubble.
Okay.
And that sounded like a bad thing, but we'll get to that when you get to your speech, too.
All right, I will answer any questions you want about
Okay.
that.
And that it truly was a world war. That we have Jeff Arnett, who flew over the hump, which was kind of legendary, with Chenault to the Flying Tigers. He told me Bridge on the River Kwai was set a little bit distance from there, but it was the same theater. So, Jeff, if you could tell us about your training that got you to the hump.
Well, I kept asking for DC-3s all the way through. Not many people did that, so they were happy to fulfill my request. I was offered or told to get in this C-47, a brand new one, down in Florida, and I flew it 14,000 miles over to India. Halfway across to Ascension Island, which is in the middle of the Atlantic, we just heard about it. In the middle of the night, I celebrated my 20th birthday. On the coast of Africa, the arriving officer there greeting the plane wouldn't believe that I was the pilot, because I was dressed in very hot Gold Coast weather, a T-shirt and Army slacks. And my crew chief had to rather unceremoniously dump my officer's cap on my head to say to this officer, "This is the pilot." Didn't believe it. Well, I spent a good deal of time in Burma in what was called combat cargo, and we were effectively the United Parcel or the FedEx of Burma, because there's no roads in northern Burma. The front had to be supplied with everything, including mules. Three big mules in the back of a DC-3. You had to be careful how you entered the plane. I'm sure you can understand that. Occasionally, we were asked to sub in on certain loads for ATC, Air Transport Command, which was flying the hump. And I claim to be a veteran of that because of about 9 trips, round trips I made over the hump. That's the worst weather I ever encountered in my life. I would have been, I thought I was gone a couple of times out of 9 trips. The air is so violent because the warm air comes up off the Gulf in India and meets frigid Arctic air coming south. And it just is a boiling point in the thing. Some planes disintegrated. They lost about 500 aircraft over the hump in the several years of operation. They lost at least 1,200 people that we know of. 1,300 were able to walk out, some of them 3 months after their families were notified they were missing. Really tough country, but it made a pilot out of you, flying a DC-3 in the ways that Donald Douglas never envisioned. Trees over there were 170 feet high. The runways were just dirt. Some of them you could not change your mind because of a hill right there, and there were old aircraft wrecks to illustrate the problems. You learned how to be a pilot over there. It was really kind of fun in a way, and I employed that in private flying in later years, flying down to Baja California when it was only 3 hotels. I mean, the airports down there kind of looked like Burma.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Jeff, to go to the next part, and we'll work back to Bud, and that was to share with us something that occurred during your time of service that not only is memorable to you to this day, but you think that the audience would be interested in hearing about.
There were 6 airplanes after the war, October 5th, 1945. 6 of us were assigned to go to Chongqing, China, and pick up Chinese officials. By the time we'd done that, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Shanghai, and we were told to go now to Formosa, or Taiwan, 100 miles off the coast, some distance away. It was obvious that we were going to arrive there after dark, and there were no lights on the Japanese airfield. And as those of you who've been to Taiwan, you know that Taihoku, as the Japanese called it, or Taipei, is in kind of a hollow. And that's where the airport was. One of our planes got there ahead of us. And he sat down on the ground and he set himself up as a mobile tower and told us what to do, and he had flares to fire, and all the 5 rest of us got in just fine, thinking we were really in big trouble, blindly making a pattern around someplace we'd never been. Everyone landed. The entire Japanese Air Force that was based there was standing out along the hangars watching us do what they didn't dare do. And that was very satisfying to watch that.
All right, George, now's the time.
You want me to read what I spoke?
Well, and I also want to congratulate George. George is the major domo for one of the golf groups, the Terrible 20s, and you brought out quite a group of folks, George. I want to show how, in which, high esteem you're held. But by the time you finish, you got to tell me about that guy under the pilot, okay?
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, I was in the service for 2 years, 6 months, and I flew 27 missions. In May of 1943, I knew my draft number was coming up, so I enlisted in the Army Air Corps. I left home on June the 24th, 3 days before I was 19. I met a group of guys in Kansas City, Missouri, got on a train to Wichita Falls, Texas. We got assigned to barracks, got our uniforms, and had our physicals. One of the inspections in the physicals they checked, we had to be nude. For this one, we had to wear our raincoats and stand in line until it was our turn. And once we got to the doctor, he was sitting in front of us. He says, "Open your raincoat, turn your head, and cough." One of the things I learned real fast is that you had to eat everything you took to eat. I took a big spoonful of mashed potatoes, which turned out to be turnips. The person at the waste barrels made me eat all of them. I've never eaten any more turnips. We're then taken to Ellington Field in Houston, Texas, and there we made a choice which group you wanted to be in, and I chose to be a bombardier. From there, I went to Stillwater, Oklahoma. There we were cadets. Everything we had to do had to be perfect, and if it wasn't, we got gigs, which is punishment to do. Most of it was walking or loss of a weekend pass. While we were there, we also went to Oklahoma State University. In my case, I got enough credits to graduate from junior college that I was attending before being called up. We had about a 10-foot high steel pipe tower on wheels with Northern Bomb Sight attached to it. It was fixed so all the conditions of the weather could affect it. The tower moved as we directed by what we put in the bomb sight, and once we got over the target, if we had corrected everything put everything right in the bomb sight, it dropped a plunger which hit the target. We also had 10 hours of flying in a single airplane that was 2 passengers plane. We learned how to fly the plane, getting out of stalls, spins, and landing it. My instructor had me at one point to slow down the airplane, and when I did, we were flying backwards. We were taken then to Childress, Texas, and there we had lots more instructions. And there were airplanes there that had made bombers. And you may have heard of the AT-11, and it was the plane I'm talking about, and the nose was changed to clear plastic, and they had bomb bay doors. We flew in them to drop sand bombs on targets made in the open fields. On one of our missions, there was a pilot and a bombardier officer and 3 cadets. To land and take off, we had to have one seat, and the other cadets sit in the bomb bay doors. At this one of the guys were talking to each other, and they said they wondered if this airplane would do a loop. It could. After the graduation was just like a graduation from high school. It was held on August the 12th, 1944. When our names were called is when we found out if we became a second lieutenant. I was also made in the afternoon after it was over. After leave of 5 days, I reported to MacDill Field in Tampa Bay, Florida. I met the other 9 others who were going to be in my crew. We practiced in the Flying Fortress, the B-17, and were assigned to the 15th Air Force 99th Bomb Group, the 347th Bomb Squadron in Foggia, Italy. The crew on the B-17 is 4 officers and 6 enlisted men. The entrance to the plane for the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, navigator, and bombardier was in the front of the plane. It was just a door underneath the skin of the airplane, which opened. You had to lift your arms up and reach the door and pull yourself into the airplane. And that is also this place that if you got into trouble that you all had to exit, and those, not the back of the airplane, but from the co-pilot and pilot forward. The entrance, it was no more than 3 feet square. The bombs carried were 12,000-pound bombs. There was a propeller on each bomb with a cotter pin placed there to prevent the bombs from becoming live. The bombardier, after the plane was in formation, had to go into the bomb bay area and remove them. The walking area in the bomb area is a steel beam about 10 inches wide with a chain line to hold on to it. One end of it has a rubber hose with a funnel on the upper end for our restroom. It wasn't much good because it was always frozen. The bombardier had 2 jobs: remove the cotter pin and ask the crew every 5 minutes if their oxygen supply was working. My first mission was on December 19th, 1994. I flew in a plane with a crew that had mission experience. There was little action, but we did have some fighter planes and flak over the target. After our bombs were dropped, our bomb bay doors wouldn't close, and we had a fire in the motor that operated them. And fortunately, we got it out pretty quick. We had to drop out of formation because we couldn't keep up. So we were lucky we didn't have any more fighter planes and didn't fly over flak areas. When we are in a flak area, the sky is full of black puffs. The sound of pieces hitting the airplane sound like popcorn. Our missions were usually at 25,000 feet, and the temperature was 10 to 60 degrees below zero. And the missions lasted around 5 to 7 hours. The bombardier takes over flying the plane when the pilot has a plane on the target path. However, since we were flying in a group of 7 planes, only the lead plane had the bomb sight, and the other planes dropped their bombs when they saw the bombs drop out of his plane. It is interesting, since Phil asked the question, what we were wearing when we were going over the targets. Underwear. A 3-piece flying suit, which was had feet, legs, and body, 3 pieces. A warm jacket, a parachute harness with your shoes attached and 1 buckle of the parachute attached. A Mae West, a hat with earphones, oxygen mask, neck microphone, and an apron flak cover that covers you. And it's pretty heavy, you could hardly move. Well, all this, in April 1944, wait a minute, excuse me. I know what I'm going to say, but I want to make sure that I say it correctly. Well, anyway, what it was, we had 1,233 airplanes, B-17s, and I was flying out of Foggia, as I said. The German army was in the foothills of the Alp Mountains, and it was getting near the war, and they wanted the Air Corps to help the ground crew in that particular battle. So there were, like I say, 1,233 airplane bombers flew on a low mission over this area, and the ground troops had put some kind of a marking so that you wouldn't drop your bombs behind those lines. That was end of my missions. I was at the base that I was on. We lived in tents like you see in MASH, and not MASH. Is it MASH? MASH. And since I had flown 27 missions, they sent me back home, one of the first to be sent back home to be trained in the B-29s. And when I got home, I had 30 days leave, and I went on the leave. And when I returned on leave, the way they discharged the soldiers were by a point system, and I had enough points to be discharged, and I was discharged. And when I was discharged, I was a first lieutenant.
Thank you, George. George Joseph, I'd like you to do the same thing about, a memorable event. But before we get to that point, since we've had a bombardier sing the praises of bombardiers, as a navigator, can you tell me how navigators viewed bombardiers? And you can be honest in this group.
Well, navigator and bombardiers, work very close together in this bubble. But at least in my plane, we never had much interaction. I happened to have a 50 caliber gun when we were on the target. That's what kept me busy. And George said, the bombardier, he has to make sure that those bombs are dropped in exactly the right place. And he, in effect, is guiding the plane, although he's sitting down below the pilot. So that's the extent of our working together. So nothing else I can say about relation with the bombardier.
Tell us something memorable in your North African experience.
Well, of course, I was a couple of years earlier than George, so experience is a little different because we had to build everything from scratch, and we lived in 4-man tents, which we threw up, and when it was cold, we built our own little gasoline stoves. We were foolish enough to hang a can of gasoline up there and have it drop gasoline down into an area, and that we set that on fire. One night, the co-pilot came in a little bit too much to drink, and he shook that thing, and the gasoline all spilled out, so our tent was gone. But anyway, we got a new tent. But the most memorable thing that I can remember is, first of all, the B-17 was an extraordinarily stable aircraft. You know, when we fly, we would fly together, but we were close together, and yet we had to be very careful because we were firing a lot of 50 caliber bullets. And these shells, these empty shells tend to come back. So you're going to lose a lot of engines just from those shells getting into it. In fact, in 50 missions, we lost practically 50 engines. But we always made it back. And at one time, our pilot, who was a young guy, bought that plane in with just one engine. The things that made the other impression on us, because we were all, all 20, 21, 22 years old, is the capability of the German pilots. They had air superiority when we first came there, and they would come after us, but they had to be careful because when we're there, we have a tremendous firepower. There are 250 calibers in the tail, there's 250 calibers in the radio turret on top, and 250 calibers in the ball turret on the bottom, and in the middle of the plane, they called it waist. There were open windows and 150 caliber going out each way, and another 50 caliber that I had up in the front. So when you put 100 planes or so up, and the German fighters, come in, and they knew how to come in, we could throw out a lot of firepower. So they had to learn how to defend themselves. And at first, they knew right away there was a distance between the radio turret and the ball turret, so they would try to come in this area. And some of them were a little bit arrogant at first. They would demonstrate how good they were by snap rolling as they're coming in and firing at us. Now, they later had a plane called the Focke-Wulf that had heavy armor on the bottom. So then they learned to come in and turn, and so you're looking at the bottom, and you're firing, and you see those tracers all going off the bottom. The other thing they developed, which in a way was beautiful the first time you saw it, is we're up above clouds, and there's anti-aircraft coming up, exploding above the clouds. And the German pilots were up on top. We didn't know it because they had their bellies painted light blue. And what they were doing was dropping bombs on our formation. And they were so good, when they dropped their bombs, they turned and come right down through the formation firing. And they had that much control. These were guys that, after World War I, which Germany was in pretty bad shape economically and otherwise, these guys learned to fly as pilots in gliders when they were 16 years old. So that's the impression I had. Once we got air superiority, everything was over. Before that, if we went on a mission to Palermo or Naples or whatever, we knew we were going to lose people. And it wasn't, buddy, sorry I'm shooting you down. It was when you see your friends bail out, parachute out, and get machine gunned on the way down by German pilots, that they mean business. So, but we came through that all right. and we were allowed to come back home after 50 missions. And after that, I spent my time training new crews. And then I was discharged in October of 45.
Before we let you go on that, I see you went to a small Eastern university after you got out of the service, John Harvard's university. What was the comparison of difficulty in the experience after experiencing what you did in North Africa and Southern Europe with being an undergraduate at Harvard?
Well, first of all, I probably shouldn't have gotten into Harvard. Harvard at that time, and maybe even today, they're great believers in diversity. So they probably had almost no people from West Virginia because they couldn't afford it. And they also, maybe fewer that had Air Force experience. So I only applied to one college, and that was Harvard. And I got in, and I was in a hurry because I had, already lost 5 years. And so I majored in mathematics and physics, and I did work pretty good, but I got out in 2 years and 9 months. And, I enjoyed it.
Just before we get to Bud, now would be the time for Chuck and Bill. Chuck and Bill, where did I get that? I'm losing it up here. Chuck and Mark to pick up any questions, but there's a special story, and I've asked Bud to talk about this. This isn't Bud and my first rodeo, but when he first told me this story, it kind of captured what there was in the experience, in addition to actually being in combat with the enemy. Bud's written a book called Glitches that tells some of the stories, and I've asked him to tell us about this pre-D-Day glitch that he experienced over England. And Bud, if you could tell us that great story.
Yes, it was amazing how many Americans died trying to go take part in a master mission. And it seemed that most of the master missions would be interrupted by a glitch in the middle, and not everyone would get tuned in as a result, and a lot of lives were lost as a result. I was remembering many of these missions, but the thing that stuck with me is how many innocent men died because of these glitches. And so I knew a lot of guys in my outfit that died because there was a glitch in the mission that they went on. And I always felt hung over by the memories of those glitches that took place on so many of the missions. And that's why I wrote the story in my book. And I can give you an example, if you like. In Sicily, the British fleet and the American fleet were poised just off the shore of Sicily, waiting for the invasion to begin. And the invasion started with our 316th Troop Carrier Group had 36 airplanes. And the first day, the paratroop were brought in and dropped over the enemy lines. And when we came back, everybody was so happy because there wasn't one shot fired. So the next day, the planes had filled up again with paratroops, and we're bringing them in for the second day. And there was, the Germans had got wind of what was happening. They came in and they had a big battle with the fleet below. And when it was over with, the word had not got back to our 316th Troop Carrier Group. So they came ahead on schedule to drop the second batch of paratroops. And when they got over the Black Night, over the fleet, one of the gunners thought it was the Germans coming back and began firing. And as a result of the 36 airplanes, 12 of them were shot down by friendly fire. And that's what happens when a glitch gets in the middle of a master program. So it's hard to forget these glitches, and they're one thing that kind of hang heavy in my mind. So that's why I wrote this book about all these glitches on these missions. And for example, on D-Day, we knew it was coming, and so our commanding officer came and called us into a meeting. He said, "We know it's coming, we don't know exactly when, but we want to do a practice mission because there's 11 other groups like ours, each one with 72 airplanes, and we're going to have to blend with them at night and make an 800 plane chain by the time we reached the Bill of Portsmouth, end of England, before taking off across the channel. And it was just one long chain of airplanes, 800 planes with over 15,000 pilots on board. Well, our mission with General Gavin was to drop paratroops outside of St. Mary Glace, because that was a main thoroughfare for the Germans to get help back to the cliff, to help their men on the cliff. So it was important that we capture St. Mary Glace. So on the flight over, the weather was kind of iffy, and we had two little blue lights on top of the wing, on top of the fuselage, to help us fly wingtip to wingtip on the way over. And everything went smoothly considering the weather was not that good. But when we arrived at Normandy, suddenly there was a land fog that went up from 0 to 2,000 feet, and we were coming in at 500 feet. So everyone disappeared from sight. All the planes that we were flying, wingtip to wingtip, next disappeared. So I veered off on my instruments to the left, climbed a little bit, and hung out in the dark, hoping that I wouldn't be in a mid-air collision. And I felt sorry for the rest of this troop that was following. So when I broke out at the top, I had to get back down to get General Gavin's men and drop them into St. Mary Glace. Well, getting back down in time for the jump was kind of a iffy thing. And I came down as slow as I could, but I finally got there in time to drop General Gavin's 82nd Airborne, who went down successfully and managed to capture the town of St. Mary Glace that day. It was the first town that was recaptured from the Germans. So it was always good to work with the 82nd Airborne. They were so strong and so capable.
I'm sure they send you your thanks too, Bud, because
Yes.
we all know, and you have related to others, that a number of the airborne folks were dropped where they shouldn't have been dropped.
Yeah.
A number of them became target practice for the Germans who were defending on the
Well, you
ground.
can see what happened with the blinding fog, making everyone get lost. And when they came out, they landed their troops in wrong places. But that couldn't be helped. So anyway, we knew that the mission was coming. And our commanding officer wanted us to make a practice mission the night before, which he wanted us to get.
I'm going to start you here, Bud, with one of the first questions. We had one that was a preemptive question. We got it before we even started, and then I'm going to ask the others to address this. The question is, how effective were the German airplanes against our air power?
Well, they were very effective, especially against the Spitfires. And when we got into the act, it kind of evened things out. But they were very formidable. And after we held Patton up the west coast of Sicily and then on into Italy, we had to move the group back to England in preparation for the Normandy landing. And so the commanding officer came in and he said, I want you to do a practice mission. Take 72 airplanes and put them in Section A, and 72 more airplanes in Section B. And I want you to keep a 20-minute spread at all times during the mission. And it'll take you 5 hours to complete it and get back. So we were coming into the home stretch, and I thought I saw 2 little pinpoints of red light in the distance. I didn't know what it was, but shortly those lights grew into our number one troop that we were supposed to have landed because we were coming in 20 minutes right on time. But the next thing I know, they came at us very quickly. They were definitely lost. And I saw the face of this one man in front of me, and he looked just as frightened as I was. And he went over the top of me, I went under him, and compression of air felt like the earthquake. And at the same time, the sky lit up like the sun had come out in the middle of the night. And it was a sad ending to that mission.
Let me ask one of the questions we had. I'm going to synthesize some of these. I'm going to start with Jeff. This question is, what impact did your military combat experience have on your professional career?
It had no impact on my professional career, but on my off days, you might say, I enjoyed flying to Baja California, as I mentioned before. And at that time, the peninsula was full of funny little dirt airstrips that ended at hillsides. And they, like Burma, had wrecks on the hill to identify the serious area. And it was just like being back in Burma. I had a great time. You just learn, and sometimes I had 7 people with me, a pretty good sized airplane, and I learned to snap them in just like you did the C-47. But it had no impact on my career.
The next question is I guess you would say this is a macro, not a micro question. It has to do, and I guess addressed to you, as they would call them, flyboys, has to be about the decision to drop the bomb with the Enola Gay's drop. And we know that that had severe psychological effects on a number of the crew of that plane. Anyway, history records that.
Well, those of us that heard from it afar, there was wild celebration.
Well, you were in the theater, right?
Well, I was in China,
Yeah.
but there was a wild celebration.
George's, any reaction?
No.
Well, I look at it as a trade-off that because if we had had to invade the island of Japan, the losses would have been very significant. Dropping those 2 bombs, while the result was terrible, it certainly helped end the war with the Japanese. And unfortunately, it's resulted now in buildup of nuclear weapons all over the world, which is, I think, terrible.
Well, this being Hollywood, we get a movie question. And I won't ask the question if none of you saw 12 O'Clock High. Anybody see 12 O'Clock High?
Oh, yeah.
All right, Jeff, you were,
Yeah.
in addition to being in Baja, you were going to the movies. The question was, 12 O'Clock High realistic?
I thought it was. The little I saw, our squadron was rather informal. For instance, 2 of our transports went up to an interior city of China after the war, and there was a large pool of unused Jeeps. We had no Jeeps in Shanghai, but 2 days later we did. You can drive 3 Jeeps very easily, or the Plymouth of a colonel you didn't like would get in there too if you could take the left fenders off. And in 2 cases, we brought a Plymouth from Kunming, belonged to a colonel we didn't like, and then we got 3 Jeeps we did like. We were the only squadron on the Shanghai base that had Jeeps, And I have a picture at home of our commanding officer sitting in one very handsomely.
All right, so this is point of personal privilege. The ball turret. I never got my answer to the ball turret. And you had your chance, George, so I'm going to ask George Joseph about it. I was told that the person who sat in the ball turret was not necessarily the tallest person in the crew. Is that true?
Well, that's true. That was a small ball. I don't know how they did it to curl up like this for 6 hours behind those two guns. I couldn't understand how anybody did that. But it was an important part of our weaponry. I'm just glad I never had to do it.
I've heard people describe that if there was a Mayday situation problem, maybe you're going to have to abandon the plane. And I forget who it was that was supposed to, that somebody had the job of pulling the guy out of there.
Well, it'd be pretty darn hard to get out because the rest of us get out pretty easily. I don't know whether that guy would get out.
And I think this last synthesis of questions might be the one that we didn't touch upon at all, and yet it's one that I'd like each of you to give me your view of. And that is, what are the emotions? So somebody is going to a job interview, or somebody's got a big situation, a big meeting, and there's this fear and this concern. You were in life and death situations. What were the emotions when you knew you get the briefing? You go in, the lieutenant colonel, the colonel gives the instruction of what the mission is, how long it's going to be to get there, what you can expect in terms of air defenses, what you can expect in terms of flak. Can you kind of describe for us, and we'll go Jeff to Bud. If you can describe for us what type of emotions you recall from that time.
Well, the peacetime one incident I recall is when we lost 11 men at one time. They were on the transport. We were changing from Luliang to Shanghai, and the plane just disappeared one night. I was flying at the same time at the night. The plane disappeared and wasn't found for 3 weeks. And it was 150 miles off course. And the Chinese are the one who found it. And they were discovered having this big funeral in a small Chinese mountain town with very fancy caskets that they had made and so forth. And that was brought into Shanghai, and a formal funeral was held in Western Shanghai. And I have a picture of that I shared with the then 2-year-old son of one of the pilots. I met him in Shanghai, showed him the picture of the ceremony. He'd never seen it, and brought him into tears there, for he's a professional pilot today. That really worked on me emotionally, and as I looked down the ranks of our pilots standing there at this 11 different coffins, I mean, right there in a row, that really took a grip on me. I don't know how I would have reacted in a combat situation on the ground. I have no idea. But we had risk every day, but 11 guys at once,
George?
Which one?
The 6 months I was there, I think I was very fortunate that things were calmed down. In the time I was at the base that I was at, we didn't lose an airplane. But all my life, I think that we've got an extremely great thing of people, because when the war came on and you were being called up, I've never seen anybody object to it. All they wanted to do was get here, get there, and particularly in England, the 8th Air Force, when they were flying 100 airplanes and only 50% of them come back, I cannot imagine how you can get in the plane the next day. And that's always been my mind, how brave, and you just do it.
George Joseph.
Well, these raids were very well organized, but to us, it became almost like going to work every day because we sometimes would have 5 missions in a week, and they'd start at 5 o'clock in the morning, and that's when you meet, and you're given the target and what time you're supposed to be there. And timing is very important because many times we're rendezvousing with a fighter group for cover. So we've all got to get to the target at about the same time. And everybody in your crew has to, be out there early in the morning. Sometimes they didn't make it. But it was amazing that after a few missions, everybody knew what was expected, and they got there on time, and the planes were very well maintained. We made it a practice to require the mechanics to go with us once in a while. So it certainly taught you to take responsibility, and I think that.
In our case, they never knew when.
Well, I'm going to change up on you, Bud. We've talked a lot about the machinery. We've talked a little about the emotion, but we haven't talked about any of the tomfoolery. And I want to talk to you about champagne.
Oh.
Because you have to tell the champagne story.
I would rather talk about the Holland invasion.
Well, you are the one who has the floor, so you could do that.
Okay.
But there was strong, and I think it might have been from the family about the champagne. But I'll tell the champagne story after you tell the Holland story.
Okay. Well, Eisenhower was talked into letting Montgomery run the Holland invasion. And a lot of people thought it was a big mistake. And I was one of those. The first day of the invasion, I took General Gavin's 82nd Airborne, and dropped 2,500 of them into Nijmegen. And the second drop was to tow a glider in to Anaheim. That was our drop zone. As the underground came through with information to Montgomery that there were tanks hidden in the grass by the landing place where we were going to tow gliders in. And he said, oh, those are worn out tanks, and they're not going to be used in battle. But in the meantime, we got ready to pull a glider in for the drop zone there in Anaheim. And it was right where the German Panzer divisions had moved into position. So we came there pulling the glider. It was absolutely a terrible catastrophe. It was the worst disaster in the whole war. But we did what we were supposed to do. And I felt sorry for the gliders that I pulled in that day, because not many of them lived through it. I got lucky, and they not only shot out my glider and everything, but they shot out my left engine. So I had to do a little finagling there on one engine, switch the cross-feed pump to the other wing, and kind of nurse this sick airplane along Well, I could see them all shooting at me from the ground. There was a forest up ahead, and my main concern was climb over that forest without making it. And I was lucky, I did get over. And so when I got on the other side, I climbed up to 2,000 feet and just hid out in the clouds there. But all my instruments were gone. So I had to drop down out of the clouds to try and see where I was. I was lucky that night. And
Well, and the people were lucky that you were there.
Yes.
That's the other part. Well, we have reached close to the end. There are a couple of other things we want to do. I understand we have Chet Schmidt in the audience. Do we have Chet? 93 years old, another WW2 veteran. And I think we can say, without fear of contradiction, that this has been one of the most important meals and programs that we've had in this room. We want to thank each and every one of you, and we want to bring up Wayne Ratkovich. He says he has something from Omaha Beach that, Bud, you may want. Wayne?
Thank you, Phil. This looks like a rock, but this morning it is a stone. We picked it up for you, Bud, from Omaha Beach. You flew over this stone 74 years ago,
oh boy,
so you have something to remember.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne. That was special. And again, as I indicated, the four gentlemen up here have indicated that they will answer questions, those we weren't able to cover now. But again, thank you very much for being here to make this special.